Dear friends, we are about to start our morning session, so please take your seats, feel comfortable. It's going to be quite long, 90 minutes. And, well, it will be about Russia. It will be not about the Russia that is usually talked about in conferences like this. I mean, you know, the power structure, the military, or the cultural, but it will be about Russians in general, the population of Russia, and basically, you know, once in the year 2000, there was a popular question, who is Mr. Putin? Now, this panel is supposed to at least partially answer the questions, who are Russians? And I would like, first of all, to introduce the remarkable experts we have here. Left to right, Vladislav Inozemtsev, Dr. Vladislav Inozemtsev, the head of what's the name of your institute?
The Center for Post-Industrial Studies.
Yes, the head of the Center for Post-Industrial Studies, no more, no less. Mr. Andrei Kolesnikov, yes, from Moscow indeed. They're actually all from Moscow. It's only me who is from somewhere else. I'm from Tallinn. Mr. Andrei Kolesnikov, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Center in Moscow. And he studies there the domestic policy. Mikhail Fishman, a very well-known person, a TV personality in Russia, formerly the editor-in-chief of the Russian edition of Newsweek magazine, and right now the presenter at TV Rain, TV Dozht, which is the only remaining truly independent TV channel in the Russian Federation. And finally, Vladimir Kara-Murza, a famous dissident, a son of another famous dissident who looks exactly like him. And he is the vice chairman of Open Russia. And Open Russia is a big, vaguely structured institution, which is more or less, well, not headed, but invested by Mr. Khodorkovsky. So this is the team of experts, and I will say a few words about what we are going basically to talk about, the overture to the panel. So I would like, we'll talk about how Russians see the outside world, and I would like to start with the opposite thing, how the world sees the Russians. I think in the perception of the global population, Russian society is more or less divided into three unequal parts. Part one, on the top, the ruling elite of Russia, which is always terrible. Starting from Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century and farther on, they're all more or less maniacs, tyrants, serial killers, corrupted idiots. There are some notable exceptions, like, I don't know, Catherine the Great, who was actually German, or Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. But, you know, even these exceptions, they more or less support the rule that the Russian ruling elite is absolutely awful. It oppresses the people, and it means a threat to the outside world. Then there is another stratum, which may be called the glorious Russian intelligentsia. And this very thin layer of Russians is mostly beloved in the outside world and widely read and seen. And I mean, the great Russian novelists, the fantastic Russian composers, scientists, intellectuals, philosophers, dissidents, and so on. And the Russian intelligentsia, of course, they are always in conflict with the Russian elite, which puts them to jail, which treats them like enemies of the people, and but at the same time, it doesn't prevent the Russian intelligentsia of still writing some great works of art, culture, and philosophy. And then, of course, is the so-called ordinary Russian people, and they make 90 or 95% of the population. So ordinary Russian people, who are they? Well, the world sees them as, well, first of all, they're very many. Second, they're rather poor. Third, they, of course, are oppressed by the authorities, by the governing elite. Then they are loved by Russian intelligentsia, who write novels about them. Well, I think that the last thing is that they're almost totally or simply totally ignored by the outside world. Nobody cares about ordinary Russian people. However, they have some kind of reputation. It is believed that Russian people are rather, well, it's a shaky reputation, but nevertheless, Russian people are rather nice, soulful, kind of honest, but not necessarily, also sometimes very cunning. But they're rather moody, occasionally violent, and of course they drink too much. That's the fact. So, and those who know Russian people better, they also notice some strangeness, some weird features among the Russian people, like I have a dear friend of mine, Eileen O'Connor, who used to be the bureau chief for CNN in Moscow for 10 years or so, in the late 80s and the 90s. And she's had a theory that Russians love to suffer. And she was absolutely serious about that. And when I told her, Eileen, I'm Russian, but I hate to suffer. I'm a fun seeker. She said, no, I'm not a real Russian. Russians love to suffer. And of course, there were a lot of arguments from real life, as well from the great Russian depressive writers like Dostoevsky, and we have plenty of them. So, and she was not the first who have noticed this fact. In the 19th century, the great Russian democratic, people-loving poet Nikolai Nekrasov wrote, «Люди холопского звания, сущие псы иногда. Чем тяжелее наказание, тем им милее господа». So, he writes about Russian peasants who at that time were slaves, and he says that, those peasant slaves, they're like dogs. The harder you beat them, the harder you punish them, the more they adore their master. And I think that probably this sensation of great collective masochism is one of the important features of the Russian people. And maybe actually this is the reason why Joseph Stalin, one of the worst tyrants in the history of mankind, is still worshipped in Russia, is still the most popular historical figure in Russia, and in various polls and ratings, he always stands above great figures like Yuri Gagarin, Vladimir Vysotsky, Alexander Pushkin, let alone Vladimir Putin, who is not tyrant enough. In 2014, after the annexation of the Crimea and Russian aggression against Ukraine, Russian people suddenly moved to the focus of academics and politicians and general public, both inside Russia and outside Russia. Because everyone, including myself, we've been really shocked well, talking about myself, disappointed with the kind of reaction Russians displayed towards the military action by Russia and the stealing of the Crimean Peninsula. The support was overwhelming and really passionate, and the whole society, felt like, we have won the Great War. And therefore, of course, there were some questions. Why do Russian people support Putin's imperialist policy so passionately? Are they ready to suffer from economic sanctions for the sake of Russia's superpower ambitions? Are they ready to sacrifice their well-being, their Hyundai cars and their holidays in Turkey for the sake of more tanks rolling into foreign lands and more missiles launched in Syria? Are they really that xenophobic and proud to see the outside world as enemies and their own motherland as a fortress under siege? Yes, and also talking about lifestyle things, is there Western glamour? And of course, well, I'm sure that most of you have been to Russia, and Moscow, St. Petersburg, they feel like real European cities. I mean, nothing's wrong there. From McDonald's to Gucci, you've got everything. So is this Western glamour only skin deep in Russia? And if it is skin deep, then what is under this skin? And these are not theoretical questions. They are very practical questions because they determine a very practical answer. What should be done to Russia or with Russia? And there are only two contradictory attitudes. First, the traditional attitude, which presumes that the leaders, the governing elite is, of course, bad, but the people are good. And if these people are taught democracy properly, they eventually will have good leaders, and Russia will become a truly democratic country, and the West will embrace it, and reinstate it in G8, and take it to the European Union, or maybe even in NATO, and so on, and everything will be good. So here the key word is integration, that Russia will be integrated with the so-called civilized world. The second attitude is based on the principle that both the elite and the people are bad, and that the Russian leaders, they're just mirroring the bad people who not only support them, but who who produces this elite and who produces the ideas it tries to put into reality. Therefore, the solution is to leave Russia alone. Leave Russia alone, not implement the so-called Western values, and abandon hope for a real friendly and understanding partnership. And in this case, all West has to do is just to keep this freaky, unpredictable, and dangerous country within its borders and not let it disturb the relatively happy life in Europe and Americas and so on. So under this scenario, the key word is not integration, but restraint or inhibition. And then you choose between the two options. And luckily, I'm only a moderator, so I don't have to answer this question. And frankly speaking, I do not have the answer. But hopefully, the expert will put some light on this really murky subject. Okay. And first of all, I would like, yes, we'll go from left to right, and Mr. Inozemtsev, Dr. Inozemtsev will be the first to speak.
Okay, thank you, Artemy, and thank you all for inviting me here. I will do my best in elaborating the thoughts which our moderator, the questions which our moderator put on. First of all, I will definitely agree with the point that the Russians are not some kind united crowd or united people. It's very different parts of the population. First of all, of course, it's Putin's gang and the close circle of Putin's friends who determine the Russian foreign policy and projects their vision of Russia into the outside world. And it was said a lot of on this group yesterday in the evening. So, of course, it's one world view, which is once again projected to the outside world. The second point, the second group is not so much intelligentsia, from my point of view, is the Russians who are living outside Russia for whatever reason. And there are two groups, as I said many times, of Russians. First of all is the group of the independent, self-made, active and knowledgeable people who went outside Russia for different reasons, who are living in many countries in the world, and who integrate in these new societies, I would say, even much more better than any other people in the world. They don't form diasporas, they infiltrate into the productive classes of this society, and this is a group which I call the Russian professionals. And I would say that they can enhance and made a lot of good for any kind of society which they infiltrate. But the other group is a group of Russians which went outside Russia well before Russia existed in today's borders, during the Soviet times or during the imperial times, and now they are living and residing in societies from Kazakhstan to Estonia, from Ukraine to different post-Soviet republics, and in their majority, it was not their will to emigrate, it was their fate to stay in the societies, and this kind of development produced several quite different attitudes to the world, making them what I call professional Russians. And the difference between Russian professionals and professional Russians is actually striking. Because the first group is really wisdom for many. The second group is evolving like a fifth column for example, for the countries like Ukraine, as we saw in Donbass. So therefore, I would say that the attitude of the Russians to the world, and of course there is a majority of the people, around 90–95%, who actually maybe they have some attitude to the world, maybe they have some picture and some their worldview, but no one cares about what this worldview is because it simply doesn't matter. Because they don't influence the foreign policy, because their decisions and their values and their attitudes are not so significant for the countries foreign policy. So therefore, I would say that looking on what Russians are thinking about the world, you should first of all focus on the ruling group, ruling elite, and on the active Russian people who are now emigrating in growing numbers. What can they bring to the world? Because maybe they will return to the country, maybe they will not, but this is a huge part of the Russian consciousness and a huge element of the Russian society. The second point, which I would like to address, is the point of values. Actually, I'm very doubtful about the special Russian values. I would rather change this terminology to two terms. The first one is not so much values as habits. And yet, of course, the Russians have the habits which they're accustomed to use in their everyday life, and they are not very happy to change these habits. And this is also a big problem for the old post-Soviet societies with a huge portion of Russian population, because these habits are very difficult to change, and this change happens actually with the change of generations. And as actually it's quite obvious to every sociologist, that the values and the norms and the habits, they don't change during the life. They're changing just with the population change. The second point here, which is very important, is the idea of norms. Because, once again, I will repeat, because a lot of Russians emigrate and live very successfully and happy in other societies, they used to accustom to new norms. And what is the biggest tragedy of the Russian society inside Russia? That this society was never governed by respected norms. If you look on the recent 18 years, when Mr. Putin took power, I would say that the norms are changing dramatically and constantly. The Russian tax code, everyone is taxpayers in their respective countries. In Russia, the tax code of the Russian Federation is amended every 14 days during 18 years. The elections in Russia since 1990 never were conducted on the same procedural laws and procedure as the elections which were held before them. Since 2001, there were 120 amendments to the electoral code under which the State Duma and the Federation Council is elected. And this is a big problem. This is, I think, what is most crucial problem for Russia, to implement norms, not to change values. Because the second point is actually, you cannot be successful in changing values in a short period of time, but the norms, as for example the European Union shows to everybody, can be changed, and the Russians can accustom for norms. They respect norms if they are stable, and if everyone is subject to them. But the third point, and the last one I would like to address, is very crucial, and I would say it's hard to change. It's the Russian identity. And with all my respect to my fellow Russian citizens, I would say that the Russian identity is an imperial one. And this is a problem of history. And I would say no one can do anything with this. Because the Russian imperial history was quite, in some cases, was similar to the European empires. In some cases, it was very different. It was similar in the case, in the sense that from the 16th century onwards, the Russians, as all the Europeans, they went outside the area of their historical metropolis and conquered a lot of territories. Spaniards, the Brits, the French, they went westwards to overseas, over the Atlantic Ocean to Americas. The Russians went so they went westwards, the Russians went eastwards, to Siberia, to the Far East. The settler colonization, which the Spaniards made in South America, and the Brits and French in North America, and what the Russians experienced in Siberia and or the Far East, was absolutely conducted by absolutely the same means, with the same goals, and even with the same results. But what happened next was a big difference, because the settler colonies of European nations were abandoned. They gained independence in the early 19th century with the American Revolution, with all the Bolivarian revolutions in South America. And then the second wave of colonization was conducted by the same nations, by Britain, by France, by Spain, and it was directed southwards, to Africa, to Asia, and so on. So the European empires have two elements, two phases of their development. The first phase of settler colonization and then of military conquest. The Russians did the same, but the subject was different. Because while the England went to America and then to India as England, yeah, maybe the United Kingdom, but major as England, and the France conquered the Louisiana and then the Indochina as France, Russia changed a lot because the conquest of Siberia was made by Muscovy and the conquest of Caucasus and Central Asia by Russia, which was Muscovy plus Urals plus Siberia plus the Far East and plus a part of Ukraine. So the subject of this colonization changed. And because of this, the Russia as a country, it's not like England or France. It was formed while building its empire. And it cannot be denied, this imperial legacy. This is a problem which you will face forever, I think. As the Russians, the Europeans, the whole world will face this problem forever. And now I will finish with the idea and the question Artemy asked everybody to think about what to do with Russia. The containment, from my point of view, is not, it's not a solution. Because if you have a huge empire on your eastern borders, it's not enough to contain it. I would make a small parallel, historical parallel with Germany, which was also a huge European empire, which was built as a Holy Roman Empire for centuries, and then evolved in the German Empire in the late 19th century. And what was the European experience with Germany? It was an experience of a great war of 1914, 1918, and then the Europeans mistakenly believed that Germany is normal power. The same mistake was done with Russia in the 90s, because the West believed Russia is a normal power. It's becoming a normal power and a normal country. But it was not true. As for Germany in the 30s, as for Russia in the 90s. Both Germany arose as a new empire and did a lot of problems to Europe, and Russia now is also arising as a new empire. And the only solution for Germany was, after the Second War, not to contain it, but to integrate it, to dissolve it in Europe. And then Germany appeared as a new engine for European growth, European peace and European development. So my point of view is that Russia will definitely fail in its new imperial experience and new imperial attempt, and then, as it returns once again to become a European power, Europe should be ready to engage it. To engage, to incorporate, and to integrate. And because I am completely sure that till Russia is outside Europe, you will never be safe. And the last point I would say is that this is a European problem, not an American one, because Russia is a European country, it developed as a European empire, and it's a part of Europe, culturally, geographically, and economically. So the Europeans should be ready to stand to the challenge of Russia now and tomorrow and in the coming decades, and you should have a plan not relying on America to save you once again. This is a major, I would say, lesson for the 20th century we debated about yesterday. Thank you.
Andrei Kolesnikov, Carnegie Center.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to be here and to talk to you. I can only strongly support the ideas of my moderator and the ideas of Mr. Inozemtsev. Especially I can support the idea of the imperial identity of Russians. It's very important to understand. And for me, the very fact of the annexation of Crimea, for instance, this is not an act of Russian nationalism. This is more act of Russian imperialism and recreation of imaginary empire. Because of that, it was supported for such extent. Nevertheless, I think Russians have kind of a mainstream ideology in their brains or in their souls, so to say. But really these values, we can assess it as dormant values. They must be awakened by somebody, and here is somebody, Mr. Putin, who awakened these dormant values. And we can name this ideology supply-side ideology. So when we lived under Mr. Medvedev, we can name him a very weak politician, but there was a talk about, I name it, device modernization, something like that. Everyone was overwhelmed by technologies, something like that. Nobody dreamed about patriotism, recreation of pride, and all that stuff. And when Putin appeared in 2012 again, the very discourse has been changed dramatically. So it was the reason for the whole nation to support the mainstream ideology. This is normal and rational for any nation, and in that sense, Russians are just like any nation. So at the same time, I must say that, yes, here is some elements of path dependence in Russian ideology and perception of the world, some historically driven ideas and, let's say, values, but I divide this skepsis about special Russian values, but there is something in the Russian air, just like Abba sang. So, and we have kind of a binary concept, binary terms, just like it was in a very famous book which was written by James Billington, The Icon and the Aches. So here is the toolkit for Putin until now. The icon, just like something spiritual, and aches as a military strength, as I don't know, violence of Russia, something like that. So. But there are several more binary elements in this ideology. For instance, power, which is equal to property, and property, which is equal to power. Very, very important to understand how it influences the very essence of Russian economic system. Having power is linked to owning property and vice versa in our economic system. State-driven economic system. So civilization and the state, this is the same. So here is the source of such a support of the state as Russia as such. So we can divide the state and Russia, we can divide Putin and Russians, but at the same time, right now in this imaginary or real ideology, this is the same. These terms are synonymous to each other. So this is the explanation, civilization state of so-called Russian world, Ruski Mir, and its imaginary borders, which are somewhere in the middle of Ukraine. And here is the reason to go to the west a little bit, but not to the Baltic states, not to Finland. This is not Ruski Mir. We don't need your territories, you know. So, and the next term, historical borders of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is also coincides with Ruski Mir. And to some extent, this world is under a spell, and this is a process of making unfreedom sacred. This is one more reason to support Putin as a symbol of this sacred reality, sacred entity. This vision is embedded in history, really. So I found in one of the Vladimir Nabokov's stories a very good quotation which explains something in today's situation. It was the story which was published in New Yorker in 1945 and was the title Conversation Peace 1945, which sheds light on Russian conservatism. So these are the words of the former White Guard colonel who is visiting kind of a respectable reception in the United States after the war. So and he says, the great Russian people has waked up and my country is again a great country. I remind, this is the end of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War. We had three great leaders. We had Ivan, whom his enemies called terrible. Then we had Peter the Great. And now we have Joseph Stalin. This is words of White Guard colonel again. I'm a white Russian and I have served to the Imperial Guards, but also I am a Russian patriot and a Russian Christian. Today, in every word that comes out of Russia, I feel the power, I feel the splendor of old Mother Russia. She is again a country of soldiers, first point, religion, second point, and true Slavs, Third point. So all the three elements are right now in this unwritten Putin's ideology. I stress this word unwritten because it's, again, it's something in the atmosphere, in the air. And it's extremely important inside this ideology, in practical terms, to name enemies. Here are external enemies, somewhere in the West primarily, and there are internal enemies. And if you will reread the speech, Putin's speech in March 18 in the year 2014, exactly after the incorporation of Crimea, you will find there all these elements of Russian ideology. And inter alia, fifth column, he mentioned this term, and national traitors. It was speech just like in 1930s. So then he delivered in the same year his address to the Federal Assembly, and he mentioned there invaluable civilizational and even sacral importance of Crimea for Russia. Russians didn't know about it. There were some suspicions that we have something sacred, but Putin explained it to his nation what is sacred and why the annexation of Crimea provoked such a big patriotic wave. So the next important point is above mentioned besieged fortress, and as a consequence, so to say, Stockholm syndrome to the commander of this besieged fortress. Despite the fact that something has been changed right now in Russia in this summer, this is another talk, and it was a talk of yesterday's panel, but it's still workable, it's still actionable, I must say. And because of that, it's so important to understand this military mobilization, permanent military mobilization, without going to war, paradoxically. Yes, Russians are ready to be mobilized in a verbal form, but not in the practical terms. If you ask an average Russian, yes, maybe even the youth is ready to serve in the army, this is prestigious, this is understandable career trajectories and salaries, so, but at the same time, they're not ready to fight in reality. So the next point is, maybe we can name it one of the pillars of this ideology, maybe we can name it negative consensus. This is negative adaptation to the economic situation primarily. We have never had it good, why start now? This is such a Russian proverb. So Russians are ready to adapt to the new normal. When you're going downstairs, all the time you're adapting to the new normal. And it explains the situation without any kind of revolutions and significant protests against something social and economic, despite the fact that here is something new again in this summer because of retirement age reform and something like that. The next point, negative mobilization and consolidation. Like this, we are under attack, we are defending ourselves in our besieged fortress from foreign enemies and the domestic fifth column. So, because of that, we are rallying around the flag, and the flag is Putin. Negative identification, this is a spiritual part of this triad. We are different, we are spiritual, so we won't peddle our sovereignty, these are words of Putin, so we have a 1,000-year history. It's more important than good economic performance. This is also words of Putin. And here is unwritten, so to say, social contract in the framework of this ideology. The glorious history is offered to citizens in exchange for their political loyalty. Well, we are fed by ideas, not by something material. Right now the situation is a little bit changing all the time because people express demand for some material, for some in social sense and economic sense, but nevertheless this model, this unwritten social contract is still workable. We mustn't underestimate the so-called historical policy. It's very important. It's one of the main pillars of this ideology. And inside this history, simplified, which is overwhelmed by mythology of different kinds, this is a long story. And in the center of this ideology is the victory in the Great Patriotic War, and Putin nationalizes, so to say, or privatizes this victory. He's the main inheritor of it, and because of that, again, he's supported. So just like it was in Brezhnev times, the same ground for the legitimacy of the regime. But there are some dividing lines inside Russian society, two of them. The first point is Stalin, which divided nations, but right now there are a lot of supporters of Stalin with very impressive figures of sociologists, not even figures, but the dynamics of support of Stalin by the mainstream Russian majority. So I will suggest only one figure, which is more or less fresh. After the year 2014, about 20% of respondents had a negative view of Stalin. This position reached its minimum in this very year, in the year 2018, 12% of the total sample. Very, very small figures. And a lot of people who are ready to appraise Stalin, and the worst thing, a lot of people who say that Stalin's cruelty was historically justified. This is the main trouble, I think, in that division. One more division is around the history of 1990s. For somebody, this is the time of disintegration. For somebody, this is the time of the best time in our lives because of freedom, because of the construction of the fundamentals of the market economy and democracy, and so on and so forth. And here is also one of the dividing lines. So, and we can say about two memories and struggle and even war between these two memories inside one historical memory, official memory and unofficial. Despite the fact that inside unofficial memory, there are a lot of people who are supporting official point of view, especially if we are talking about Great Patriotic War. But at the same time, this is a war between two types of memory, around Putin, around Stalin inter alia, and around 1990s, and at the end of the day around Putin, because this simply pseudonyms of Putin's regime. I mean Stalin and 1990s. So, and the last maybe point is extremely important that this Russian public opinion, so to say, public sentiments, they're very flexible. They can be changed overnight because of something. We can say that the Russians forever are nationalist imperialists or something like that. And you can see the fast changes, quite contradictory during the last summer. But what is important, not even in terms of ideology, but in terms of practical political behavior of people, Putin's image, which was equal to the image of Mother Russia. Russia is Putin, Putin is Russia. It was really so. Putin is symbol, Putin is a flag. Putin has only symbolical corpse, not living flesh. It found out in this summer that Putin has living flesh and he can share responsibility for unpopular steps. And this is great divergence. Putin image and that of Mother Russia have now diverged for the first time since the annexation of Crimea. And maybe you have noticed some figures of his approval rating. Very significant slump from 80% of approval of his activity to 70% right now. And this is a new reality. The important thing that this is indicator at the level of pre-Crimean time. Not the figures as such, but the fact that here is a slump of this approval rating to the level of the pre-Crimean time. So here is a big picture. I will stop myself right here.
Mikhail Fishman, independent journalist and TV presenter.
Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here and share flow with such outstanding panelists. I'm not an expert. I'm a practicing journalist, reporter so I will look at this picture of Russian worldview from this perspective of my, I don't know, more or less 20 years experience of reporting on Russia's politics. But and I'll try to sound the most optimistic I can, actually. I'll start with trying to debunk some points or ideas that we probably all seem to share. Like starting with what is worldview? Worldview, of course, reflects the, well, I'm feeling shy of talking about national identities. It's very hard to talk about national identities, but there are certainly some concepts that nations share. And of course, there is always the role of the elite in constructing, building, presenting these concepts to the nations, and we'll probably all agree then that the less efficient, the weaker are the institutions, the more important is the role of the elite in shaping the worldview of any nation, and Russia is not. Russia is, of course, one of these examples. But let's start with what our panel actually starts with, Stalin. And the numbers that Andrei Kolesnikov just shared with us are indeed frightening, aren't they? And most Russians consider Joseph Stalin the most outstanding person in world history. That's what polls actually say in Russia, and taken like this for granted, it sounds kind of terrifying, right? Doesn't it? Because we all, sitting in his room, we know that Stalin was a bloody murderer who executed basically and tortured his own nation. How on earth a nation could praise a person like that?
They like to suffer.
No, I have a different answer to this question. Let's not, because Stalin is a symbol. It's not that real person that people think about when they answer these polls. It's a symbol. And symbols have to be taken and evaluated at some other level. They represent something, but not necessarily what they directly point to. And this is exactly, and it's not only the case only of the image of Stalin, but it definitely is one of these symbols. So let's better understand what the symbol means. And well, it's of course we will, if comparing with the 90s when attitude towards Stalin was very different from what we see now, what we have now, we will have first to clean these numbers from the impact of time, because in the late 80s, perestroika was full of actually coming ahead with pictures of Stalin's terror. That's when the nation actually learned what Stalin was and what Stalin time really was. That was in the 80s. So 90s were still full of this memory of remembering what Stalin was. But even if we clean this, sort of take this impact out of the picture for a while, I think that still Arseny Raginsky, the founder of Memorial, and who dedicated his life to preserving memory about Stalin's terror, made it his career and life activity. He was very straight about it. Stalin is an index. The image of Stalin is an index of something else. What is it? It's the concept of uncontrolled, unchallenged, unchecked state, strong state, the state with centralized power, the state that stands above the nation and is uncontrolled by the nation. The more the society agrees with this kind of concept of the state, the better the image of Stalin is. The less it does so, the worse Stalin's image is. And if we look at these numbers of Stalin from this perspective, well, it's not, let's stop panicking then, because it's not about murdering people. It's not about agreeing even, and yes, these numbers still sound very unpleasant, that mass murders were justified by some greater good or something. But still, if you, the other numbers, the other polls will show that, yes, people know about mass repressions. People do remember. Yes, this memory is fading and getting back to memory, but it's still there. And they somehow, how to explain that the nation praises Stalin and still rejects the idea of mass repressions if we take Stalin as a symbol of this uncontrolled and strong state. And that's it. Well, think of it as a sort of a Big Mac index, but relating to social identity of the nation and its attitude towards the state. And it will be much easier to accept these numbers, and they will not sound that terrifying, right? So we're talking about worldview and this Stalin's index, let's say. Already respected panelists here shared, and it's obvious, of course, we know that now Russia sees itself as a besieged fortress, as a successor, let's say, on the world stage to the Soviet system, basically trying to get back to this kind of relations of, with the West. We all know that, and it's all true. And this is this idea of Russia's greatness, or this empire feeling that already has been talked about here before. And of course, we all know that. One thing that I remember, and I think is correct, though probably debatable, is that the concept of Russia's greatness, of Russia's special status in the world, does not necessarily come together with the idea of the Cold War and the zero-sum game with the rest of the world, which is, of course, the case now, which was, of course, the case during the Soviet era. The concept of that Russia is special, that Russia is great power, of course, Yeltsin shared it, and it was shared during Yeltsin's times. If you take a look at recently declassified interaction between Yeltsin and Clinton, you will see that Yeltsin sees himself as true Russian patriot and the defender of this kind of Russia's greatness. But back then, in the 90s, it didn't come along with this nostalgia for Soviet times, with the idea that back then the order was right during the Cold War. No, that it went along with totally different idea of new free Russia, which is free from its Soviet conceptual, let's say heritage. Of course, it's not, well, and the 90s show that the idea of Russia's great status do not necessarily lead to Cold War. Well, yes, there were tough moments, of course, like in Kosovo in 1998, and yet the year before that, Russia was invited to G7. It was like, what, a few months before Kosovo happened. Yes, there were some tough times, and the picture is more sophisticated that I'm trying to show right now. Of course, I understand that, and there was growing frustration within the nation because these times were quite hard for everyone, and people started feeling that they have to compensate somehow for these material losses they were going through. This is all correct. Yet, Russia was, in the 90s, in the concept of Russia as a power, was built on a different ground, comparing to Soviet times. So when Stalin does get back to the picture, actually, it happens in 2005. This is when Stalin again gets back to textbooks, gets praised in official textbooks. This is when he is on television as the most popular person in Russia. What is 2005? Just remember what it is. It's when Yeltsin's times ended finally, and well, probably forever. It's when so-called sovereign democracy started. It's when all the institutions of the 90s and Russia's democracy of the 90s were finally demolished and ruined. It's when freedom of the press ended. It's when for the first time, obviously and openly, what happened in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, was seen officially as a zero-sum game between Russia and the West. And that's when Stalin gets back to the picture, as well as the concept that the new Russia is not new Russia. It's this old Soviet Russia, which is successor to. And Yeltsin's time, and the more we live through this, let's say, Putin's era, the more time gets its record, the more it has its impact, because we live under Putin now twice as long as we lived under Yeltsin. So now, well, the nation has to share this. Because there are no other concepts left, that these 90s, this period of time was sort of a messy turnover between the long, eternal flow of Russia's greatness. And this Russia's greatness is seen very differently, of course, now. It's seen as, yes, now it's this great power which could take any form. Would it be Tsarist Russia, would it be Soviet Russia, or would it be Putin's Russia as it is now? But it is the society and the rule of one highest authority and so-called order and so-called stability. That's where we are now, and that's from where we have to look at what will be next and what is the worldview. Well, I probably do.
Thank you, Misha.
Much, yes, time left.
Thank
Sorry.
You. And Vladimir Kara-Murza, please mind Volodya that our time is running out.
Thank you, Artemy, and thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers of the Riga conference. It's always a pleasure to be here. I remember being at the very first one, I believe it was 2006, coincided with the NATO summit here in Riga. The president of Vika Freiberger hosted just a few blocks down. And I think the Baltic states are a particularly apt place to be discussing the question that we're discussing today. Every time I am in another Baltic capital, in Tallinn, the city where our moderator lives, I always make a point of going to Nune Street, which is a small street just off the old city, the lower part of the old city, where on the old wall, just before the staircase that leads up, there is a bas-relief that was installed about 5 years ago with the support of the Estonian Memory Initiative. And that bas-relief, the inscription on it reads that the bas-relief was installed in honor of the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, and the role that he played in helping to bring about the peaceful restoration of the independence of the Baltic states in 1990 and 1991. And when I stand there looking at that bas-relief, it's always interesting to notice the reaction from Westerners, from lots of Western tourists who pass by, and the initial reaction from most of them is puzzlement. People stand and they read it. It's in 3 languages, Russian, Estonian, and English. And people read and reread again and kind of see puzzlement on their faces. How is it possible that a Russian president could help Soviet captive nations achieve independence? Because that's something that seems inconceivable today, in the year 2018. But that is, of course, exactly what happened. And as many of my Baltic friends and people who helped bring about the independence, like Professor Landsbergis attest, Yeltsin's support was crucial at that time. And in January of 1991, when the Soviet government sent tanks into Vilnius, and we had clashes with the Soviet OMON here in Riga, Boris Yeltsin, who wasn't president yet, he was Speaker of the Russian Parliament, but he was a nominal head of state in the Russian Republic, he flew to Tallinn in a defiant gesture and signed treaties of cooperation with the representatives of all 3 Baltic states. And on behalf of the Russian Federation, he expressed support for their independence and self-determination. About 3 weeks ago, another Baltic capital commemorated another Russian democratic leader when the city of Vilnius officially unveiled Boris Nemtsov Square in the Zverinas district, just in front of the Russian embassy there, to commemorate the former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia and the leader of the democratic opposition to Putin, who was gunned down in front of the Kremlin in February of 2015. And at the opening ceremony there, Lithuanian Foreign Minister Linas Linkevičius made very moving remarks, and one of the things he said was that it was important for Lithuania to stand in solidarity with Russian Democrats who had stood in solidarity with Lithuania in its most difficult hour. And he recalled how in January 1991, as Soviet tanks were rolling into Vilnius, 500,000 people, Russian people, stood on Manezhne Square in Moscow, just outside the Kremlin walls, calling on the Soviet government to keep its hands off the Baltics. So I think it's very important to remember that it wasn't just the Russian leadership, it was also the Russian people. And we don't need to go back a quarter of a century to see that kind of sentiment in Russian society. My colleagues on the panel and our moderator, Artemy Troitsky, has several times referred to the year 2014 as the peak of this pro-imperialist hysteria, Krim Nash, everything to do with Ukraine, that we all remember too well. But it was also that time in 2014, in fact it was 4 years ago this month, in September of 2014, that Boris Nemtsov led what would turn out to be the last march of his life through the streets of Moscow. And that march was called in opposition to Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine. It was called the March of Peace. And I have to be honest that we were not sure, when we were in the process of organizing that march, we were not sure how many people would come. Because, of course, it was the height of that hysteria, and if you watched Russian state television, you would hear every day that everybody in Russia supports Vladimir Putin and what he's doing to Ukraine. And the only opposition comes from a fringe group of national traitors in the 5th column. And so, you know, when the propaganda drumbeat is so loud and so relentless, sometimes even some of us are beginning to have doubts, so we were not sure. And I have to say that we were shocked by the turnout, in a very good way. So the march route was from Pushkinskaya Square, down the Boulevard Ring, all the way to Sakharov Avenue, where the Garden Ring begins. And those of you who've been in Moscow, which I imagine is quite a few people in this room, know that this is a very long way. And all of the Boulevard Ring, both sides of it, from Pushkin Square all the way down to Sakharov, was filled with people. And I remember watching this, you know, this sea of faces. And when we, actually those of us who were in front of the rally, when we'd got to the end point, we got a call from one of the organizers who said that people were still lining up to go through metal detectors at the beginning of the march, back on Pushkinskaya Square. And it was a really unusual feeling, watching the sea of faces, these tens of thousands of people as far as the eye could see. The people that, according to the Kremlin's propaganda, do not exist. I think, as a historian by education, I think that stereotypes are rarely helpful in history, in politics, in international relations, in anything. And probably even more importantly, most of the time the stereotypes are not true. Now, the stereotype about Russians that we've been discussing a lot today is that we crave for a strong hand domestically, and we want to subjugate other countries to our will on the international stage. And no doubt there are Russians who think exactly that. Just there are citizens of liberal Western democracies who are voting for very illiberal far-right or far-left parties. But again, that might be a consequence of my historical education, but you know, I always prefer to look at facts rather than at stereotypes, and that we actually look at facts. So when it comes to domestic politics, every time the Russian people actually had a chance to choose in a more or less free election between dictatorship and democracy, which was unfortunately admittedly not too often in our history, but every time the Russian people got a chance to choose between dictatorship and democracy, they always chose democracy. 1906, the first election to the Tsarist State Duma, It was won by the Constitutional Democrats, the leading pro-Western, pro-reform party at the time. Supporters of the Tsarist autocracy failed to win a single seat, 0. 1917, November, the election to the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, which was held a few weeks after the Bolsheviks had seized power by force. And they lost that election, humiliatingly, to a party called the SRs, which was also a left-wing but a democratic party that advocated for a parliamentary republic as opposed to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And of course, something that is in my living memory and in memory of most people in this room, June of 1991, the first ever direct election for head of state in the history of Russia, when the candidate of the democratic opposition, Boris Yeltsin, defeated the candidate of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov, by 57% to 17%. These are facts, these are not stereotypes. And if we're talking about the imperial mentality, which many of my colleagues have talked about today, I think it's also important to remember that every time the Kremlin sends tanks on foreign soil to try to keep other countries to toe, there are always Russians who stand up publicly to say, not in my name. Sometimes it's 7 people, like in August of 1968 in the famous Red Square demonstration against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And sometimes it's 500,000 people, like in January of 91 on Manezhny Square against the aggression on Lithuania. So one of the questions that were posed by Artemy at the beginning of our discussion was that, what do Russians really think? Of course, there can be no single answer to this question, just like there can be no single answer to the question of what do Latvians or Italians or Americans think. Societies are made of different people with very different views. And so I think every one of us on this panel and our moderator can give, and everybody in this room can give very different answers to this question. But what I would ask our friends and our colleagues in the West to do is to resist falling into that trap set up by the Kremlin propaganda, according to which, to use the words of Vyacheslav Volodin, the current Speaker of the Russian State Duma, and I quote, "There's no Russia without Putin," end of quote. Probably the most insulting thing I've ever heard said about my country. Last night at one of the night owl sessions that was also dedicated to Russia, there was a lot of discussion about the protests that have begun last year and that have continued since the spring of last year all across the country. And I think it is very important to keep in mind that those thousands of people, predominantly young people, who are prepared to come out to the square and to the street to protest against the corruption and the impunity and the arrogance of this regime, despite the dangers and the threats and everything that entails, those thousands of young people, they're no less Russian than those who are sitting in the Kremlin today. It's important to remember that there's a Russia beyond and much better than the current regime. And I think that those people who have been going out and continuing to protest all across the country, I think those people, if I may say so, offer a much greater hope for the future of our country than those people who currently are sitting in the Kremlin. So thank you very much. Thank you, Artemy, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir. So now we are starting the Q&A section, and I will be the first. I will be the first to ask question, and I would like to ask one question, Andrei Kolesnikov. I like the idea of dormant values, which Mr. Putin has waken up. So, but are there any other dormant values in the Russian society except for the aggressive, imperialist and isolationist ones? Are there any dormant Christian values? And of course, Russians are very proud that they're Orthodox Christians and so on. They don't go to churches, but anyway, they all believe that they are true Christians. So, Christian values, free-loving values, and so on. And if they do exist, then why they are not on demand?
I think they are on demand because we lived more or less normal life in the 1990s because the very atmosphere of the country was other one. I would say that Russians have the same values as any other nation on this planet. And even Ekaterina the Great said that Russia is a European country, and this is partly true, especially when we are talking about, so to say, unconscious consumer liberalism of Russians. They are ready to consume capitalism in a capitalistic way, in a way of market economy, at the same time supporting something spiritual, imperial, orthodox, and so on and so forth. There were some hopes that, according to the so-called Lipton hypothesis, that growing wealth of Russians will help them to be democratic. And it was partly true, but it wasn't whole true about Russians. So, here is no straight link between consumer liberalism and democratic values, so to say. We have made a research in a previous, in the summer of 2017 about perception of changes. And people said that they are ready for changes. 42% said we are for decisive changes, 41% said we for moderate changes. But again, when we peered into details, it found out that decisive changes, this is something just like, which is equal to normal life, better life, more food, more durable goods, more cars, and so on and so forth. If Stalin will deliver it, so okay, we will perceive it. But 41% moderate changes, gradual changes. This is more about advanced classes, urban classes, educated classes, which are ready to get something political from the external environment. So this is very contradictory. But again, these values are embedded in any nation, and Russians are not excluded from this row.
Yes, thank you. You please.
Thank you. Klaus Wittmann, the Aspen Institute, Germany. I found this very interesting and encouraging, and I have two quick remarks to which I would like to elicit reactions. Mr. Timochenko made a very interesting distinction between values and habits. I have a similar differentiation pertaining to interests. What is declared often as Russian interests, in my view, are more political, psychological sentiments. Humiliation, loser of the Cold War, non-acceptance by the US as a great power, etc. And in fighting this, in wanting to enforce great power status, instead of earning it through constructive contributions to regional and global problem solving, I think the Russian leadership acts against the real long-term interests of Russia. And in this context, I would like to take issue with the other parallel Mr. Timochenko made, Germany in the 30s and Russia in the 90s. Karaganov once went even further and said, Russia is today in the same situation as Germany after Versailles, which I find grossly exaggerated. The West did make mistakes, but it did not do everything wrong and offered many opportunities for the integration and engagement of Russia you asked for. And as far as NATO is concerned, I was part of it since the day in October 1990 when I got the task to draft for the chairman of the military committee, the highest soldier in NATO, the welcome speech for General Moiseyev when, as a Soviet short, he visited NATO for the first time. And so sometimes I like to regard myself as a temporary witness for the sincerity of our cooperation offers to the Soviet Union and later to Russia. Thank you.
Danke.
Hello, my name is Lasha. I'm from a tiny country called Georgia, whose 20% is currently occupied by Russia, but is still striving to EU, NATO integration. So having a passport of Georgia makes me one of the very few nations representatives from the Caucasus region that have a right and voice to the conferences like this. And there are many more nations in my region that will never be able to come and speak to the events like this. If you look at the history of the Imperial Russia as well as the Soviet Union, you see that the whole lot of efforts have been made to erase a lot of Caucasian nations from the earth. and they have been ignored, and they have been just left aside in terrible conditions. So don't you think that the West, both media as well as scholars, are being extremely ignorant to the diversity you have in the Russian Federation? That, you know, they try to portray that Russian is someone, you know, drinking vodka and ushanka and matryoshka and, I don't know, many other things, caviar and stuff, but there are many other more nations, tiny nations in that federation that are being constantly ignored. So every time I go to conferences or to the academic, like the scholarly events, I see that the diversity of Russia is always being ignored. I mean, it's portrayed like, you know, the Orthodox country, but what about rest of the residents of the very diverse regions of the Federation? Yeah.
Does anybody want to comment on the speech?
Yeah, I can, because
I
I completely agree with our German colleague, and I appreciate what he was doing in the 90s, and actually I think that the effort should be once again on the table when Russia changes its course sometime later. As a Georgian colleague is concerned, yes, I agree. The problem is that the Russian society is not so united, but I can explain this Western approach just by once again going back to the Russia as an empire. You said several times that there are a lot of people in this federation. Look, it's nonsense. Russia is not a federation. What is federative in Russia except of its name? Nothing. So because Russia is not a federation, the Western approach to it as a unified country is actually true, because there's nothing federative in it. And if it would be a federation, it would be mentioning of diversion. Now it's united as a political subject, a political entity.
Okay, matlobt, as they say it in Georgian.
Chom.
Yes. Second row.
Thank you. Very interesting panel indeed for someone who tries to understand the Russians. Nobody mentioned theories like Neo-Eurasianism, and I have the impression sometimes that in the beginning, Neo-Eurasianism, with people like Dugin, who was too easily dismissed as a clown, or that from a convenient narrative, romantic narrative to support the greed of power, to explain the greed of power to the public, it has evolved into one of the marking points of foreign policy. So the question is not so much whether Eurasianism has a scientific ground for study, but do people recognize themselves, and thus do these narratives resonate with people? Because if they recognize themselves in them, then the perception becomes more important than the reality. And so the question is, to understand the Russian people, do we more need to read Trubetskoy, Gumilev, Panarin, and Dugin?
Thank you.
I want to comment on actually what the colleague from Germany said a few minutes ago, because thank you so much for raising this point. That raises a very big and important issue that's relevant both for the 90s and for today. I don't need to tell anybody here in Riga or many other Central Eastern European capitals how much importance the incentive of European and Euro-Atlantic integration had in the 1990s for so many post-communist countries that successfully reformed after being freed from Soviet rule. And I think it's very important to remember that one of the biggest differences between what happened in Central and other Eastern European countries and what happened in Russia is that we never really had this incentive. And, you know, Václav Havel called the entire process of post-communist reformation a return to Europe. That was his term. And so many countries managed to do this. We were never really offered that. And in no way I'm trying to say that the failure of our democratic transition in the 1990s was the West's fault. That would be too easy, and also that would be inaccurate. The biggest mistakes and the biggest missed opportunities were from the Russian side, no question about it. But I think it was an important failure on the part of the West in the 1990s that they were not ready, that you were not ready enough to welcome and embrace a new and democratic Russia into your ranks. I'll just give just one example. I don't doubt at all the sincerity of many people within the European and Euro-Atlantic institutions who genuinely wanted to integrate Russia. But unfortunately, this never reached the highest levels. And the example I would give is December the 26th, 1991. Literally the next day, after the red flag came down on the Kremlin for the very last time, there was a North Atlantic Council meeting in Brussels at NATO headquarters, and it was chaired by Manfred Werner, the General Secretary of NATO. And as the council meeting was underway, the Russian ambassador came in, and he hand-delivered a letter from President Boris Yeltsin, addressed to Secretary General Werner. And that letter, it's since been published, you can all read it. That letter, signed by the President of Russia, officially raised the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That letter did not even receive a response. And this is just a small illustration of that lack of willingness or readiness. I don't know how best to term it, and I'm not even talking about the European Union as well. I think it's very important to remember, as Dr. Vladislav Inozemtsev said in the opening remarks that he made here during this panel, that Russia is a European country. Let's not forget that. That's just a matter of not just basic geography, that's without dispute, but also of our culture, of our mentality, and of our history. And I think it's very important not just to talk about these lessons and to analyze these lessons, but to draw conclusions for the future. And so my point is that it's important for both of us to learn from our past mistakes. And the next time when Russia embarks on a democratic transition, which will happen because nothing is forever, I think it's important for our friends and colleagues in the West to stand ready to welcome a future democratic Russia into their own ranks. As Dr. Inozemtsev said, integration, not containment.
Okay, strangely enough, the question on Eurasians, who I personally always thought are a set of clowns and idiots, but all the members of the panel want to comment on this.
I have a broader sort of comment on whatever.
Not too broad, please.
No. I mean, not exactly on Dugin, but on the idea of any. Russians are different, as Vladimir said. They share different ideas and worldviews, whatever. But the problem is that we can hardly evaluate what they think, what they really think, because not only it is the matter of heavy and very aggressive propaganda that Russians are under at the moment. Much more aggressive, I think, actually, than the Soviet propaganda was. But also the central idea of the government, or the concept, is censorship. We are used to think that basically the government fights the liberals. This is not the case. The government fights any independent, genuine activity, idea that it sees starting growing wherever in its view. Would it be Dugin? Would it be liberals? Would it be Ruski Mir in East? If it's genuine, people can think so, can really share these emotions. When the government sees it started growing, it starts suppressing it, and it's important to understand.
Sometimes we follow Kremlin's myths, not only in the sphere of politics, but in the sphere of mythology. And this is a mythology that Dugin is influencing anything in the Kremlin. Yes, he played for some time in some dirty games of Kremlin, but not now. He's not influential in the sense that he's not the god for Russians and the person to follow too. And Eurasianism is a very small bunch of ideas, old-fashioned. If you ask an average fascist or Russian nationalist, he will never answer you who is Mr. Trubetskoy, for instance. Kremlin tried to adapt to its needs. For instance, philosopher Ilyin, who was close to fascist thinking and who lived in Germany after the immigration in the 1920s, tried to adapt even Berdyaev to Kremlin needs. It's hard to understand to average people how it works, so they decided not to use such a sophisticated tools.
Yeah, I would say a couple of words on this neo-Eurasianism approach, because you quoted neo-Eurasianism as a theory. It is not a theory. Maybe it's a concept, but to say about it as a theory, you should find some facts, some grounds, some arguments. There are none of them. And what I would like to say as the most crucial point is that if you are looking on the people in the central Russia, who never, interacted with the Asians, with the Chinese, with the Kazakhs, and whatsoever, they are more inclined to Eurasianist thinking because they have no proof of interaction. But as you are going to the east of Russia, for example, to Novosibirsk, to Irkutsk, to Blagoveshchensk, the more eastern you go, the less Eurasianism ideas you will find, because people in Khabarovsk, they feel themselves 100% European because they see Asians across the Amur River in China. And there's no ideas and no illusions of Eurasianism. So Russia is definitely a European country, and I will repeat it as many times as I can.
Thank you.
Inga Paliani, Georgia. Dear speakers, thank you very much for the interesting and comprehensive picture of Russia you gave. You spoke about certain dates in the modern history, in the recent history. You mentioned 1990s, went even so far as 1968. You mentioned 2005, you mentioned 2014. You spoke about pre-Crimea, post-Crimea. But I have a question. There is one date which I think all of us remember. It is 2008. None of you has mentioned that. And as a result of that war, we today have an occupation of a big part of Georgia. We have violations, grave violations of human rights. We have the murders of the citizens of Georgia. Why aren't you mentioning these facts? This would give even a fuller picture of the modern Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, I can try to explain this fact, and I would say I will be not very politically correct, but from my point of view, and I just stick to this point of view, the Russian intervention in 2008 was very well, I would say, very well fit into the Western political agenda of the time. So even President Medvedev, who was the leader of Russia at the time, used the rhetorics of humanitarian intervention when the Russians went into South Ossetia. And I would say that what happened in 2008 in northern Georgia, in South Ossetia, and in Abkhazia was actually the continuation of a long period of internal struggle which began in the 90s. Georgia, as several other post-Soviet countries, was a bit resembling a Russian imperial approach towards South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I'm not an expert in Georgian politics, but Abkhazia and South Ossetia were semi-independent for years, before 2008. And the resemblance between the Kosovo case and Abkhazia case, for example, was striking for me. Abkhazia was and is, since the time, a quasi-independent country, as the Kosovo is. It was not annexed by Russia, as Kosovo was not annexed, for example, by Greater Albania. And therefore, the Western countries accepted a bit this approach because it was not so inconvenient for the rhetorics of humanitarian intervention, for what the West did in former Yugoslavia, and whatsoever. So therefore, 2008 was not a crucial time for split between Russia and the West, and it was not. And Mr. Sarkozy organized this peace deal, and everything was forgotten quite soon. So therefore, I think if we look for the origins of the Russian imperialism, it was not in 2008. The aggression against Ukraine, the capture of Crimea, the war in Donbass in 2014 was absolutely different in nature. It was an unprovoked aggression from the Russian side. But in Georgia, it was a completely different case, I would say.
I disagree, but thank you anyway. Please.
Thank you. Collins from the Latvian Parliament. Since we're in Riga, I'd like to return to the issue of the Baltic and the Russian people. As a Latvian politician, I often have to explain that there are no problems between Latvians and Russians. The problems are between Riga and the Kremlin, Kremlin and Brussels, Kremlin and the rest of the world. And I think Vladimir did a very good job of already describing the good relations between Russians and the Baltic people. But we should recall that 2005 was also the year after the Baltic states joined NATO. And the propaganda, the anti-NATO, anti-Baltic propaganda, was stepped up considerably against us. And my question is, to what extent do the Russian people believe this propaganda, that the Baltic states, as a member of NATO, are now a threat to Russia? Has that changed the attitudes of the Russian people? Is this propaganda working to any extent?
Well, to make a long story short, I think, yes, they do. If you look from the perspective of average Russian now, you will see that you will have very little choice because there are no alternative picture of which you would be able to share. There's only this heavy, very extremely heavy propagandistic image of besieged fortress, and in which, of course, NATO is portrayed as a main enemy. There is no question about that. So you are now part of this broader government, and you have to feel like it. Well, there always will be intellectuals and some part of the society, but I think the greater majority of, if you conduct a poll, would say that yes, that Baltics joining NATO means that they are now posing threat to Russia. This is, I think, the most obvious answer that you will get.
I think it's much more simple. Most Russians believe that Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are fascist state. And they put it straight.
I didn't say that.
Okay, yes, please.
My name is Sergei Spotopkins. I'm a member of Latvian Parliament and Russian who was born in Latvia in 1977. So my question, would you please touch the Western role in creating the myth of homogenic Russians, myth of Russians who, all 25 to 30 million Russians who live outside Russia, that all Russians are supporting Putin, because after 2014 I have personal feeling that after introducing myself I have to say immediately, yes, I am Russian, no, Crimea is not Russian, and no, I don't support Putin. After that I can continue the discussion, and I think also elites, they do not make difference between Russians and Russia and Kremlin and Putin. We often hear about Russian aggression, Russian nation aggression against Western values, but I believe it's not true, and I believe that creation of these myths do not help you in your attempts to change Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei, for the question. And unfortunately, this problem is nothing new. It goes back a long, long time. And for example, in 1979, 1980, just after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Vladimir Bukovsky was a legendary Soviet dissident, just a few years after he'd been expelled to the West. He published a big article saying that this is just a completely schizophrenic language that's being used. And he pointed to articles, I think it was in the New York Times, that was the same article was talking about, quote, Russian troops in Afghanistan, and, quote, Soviet academician Andrei Sakharov protesting against the invasion. So the complete reversal of what it really should be. And I had a conversation recently with a friend in Stanford who is in charge of the democracy program, and he's writing a book about Western approaches to Russia. And he asked me, could you give me just a few things that you think are important for us Westerners to do, when we approach Russia and the Putin regime? And before I even went to talk about substantive big things, I said to him, please stop saying Russia when you mean Putin. Please stop putting this equation mark between a large country, very diverse country, and a small clique of crooks, kleptocrats, and criminals who are sitting in the Kremlin. That's not one and the same thing. I mean, there can be a big debate about whether in democratic countries a government can speak on behalf of the whole nation. Well, surely it can't in an authoritarian regime, where we don't have the right to elect our own government, where our parliament's not a place for discussion, where we've had the same person sitting in power now for almost 19 years, without term limits, without democratic elections, without any of this. So it's actually a sore point for us that you raised, that so many people just use this kind of sweet brush to paint everybody. And I mean, if you have to say you're not against, that you're against Putin, imagine the big introduction we have to give, those of us who are in Russia. And that is a big problem, and we always ask people to please make a difference between a country and a regime that is misruling our country.
Yes. Okay, so it looks like we have to finish. No more questions. Terribly sorry about that. As usual, we've had an interesting talk. No answers, more questions. And paldies. And thank you very much. Спасибо большое. Спасибо нашим экспертам и спасибо уважаемой аудитории. Thanks a lot.